So a few weeks back I made a performance video where I play this tune Infant Eyes, and a lot of people asked me if I could make a video on the tune, and with a lot of people I mean like 2. But anyway, so that got me thinking I should make a video on how you can solo over a tune like this. I'll also make a PDF with the chords that I played there, and I'll put it on my Patreon page. So when we're trying to solo over a tune like Infant Eyes, there are a couple of things we need to consider. And the stuff I normally talk about in my videos, like bop scales and guide tones and that kind of stuff, doesn't really apply to this kind of tune for 3 reasons. It's a non-functional harmony tune, so we're going to talk about that. It's a Wayne Shorter tune, and we're going to talk about that. And it's a ballad. I'm going to talk about all those things, but we need to get right into it. We need to figure out, before we do anything else, what scales we are going to use over each chord. So we'll take a look at that. So I'm going to play the first 4 bars, the first 4 chords here. G minor, F minor, E flat major 7, to A 13 flat 9. So if we're going to try to improvise over these chords, we need to figure out a mode for each chord. I think of each chord as its own mode, even though you could argue that the first 3 chords belong to E flat major. But if I play E flat major over all those 3 chords, it doesn't sound good. Now, how do I know that? Well, because I've tried. I mean, you can totally do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't try it, but it's not the first choice that I would suggest. It would sound something like this, right? Here it sounds good on the F. So why is this? I think because the whole tune gives you kind of a feeling of different modes, different colors, and it doesn't give you a feeling for any kind of key center. The whole thing starts with a G minor. So here, when we hear that, we don't know that we're in E flat. You know what I mean? It's a totally different thing if you're playing, if we would have started on the E flat. Like, for example, in Moment's Notice, in the vamp at the end there. Those are the same 3 chords, but in a different order. And there, I would totally play E flat major over the whole thing. But when I hear this, I hear this. Not that not Phrygian, if that makes sense. So I'm thinking of each chord as its own little mode. So it's better to play arpeggios than scales. So extended arpeggios. That's a G Dorian scale, played as an extended arpeggio. F Dorian, and E flat Lydian. The A 13 flat 9 suggests the half whole scale. There are other scales that you consider, but I don't want to get stuck in that conversation. So let's think of it as a half whole chord. So then there are different kind of extended arpeggios that you could come up with. You have to treat it a little bit differently. Let's use that for now. Again, you could come up with other arpeggios for that chord if you want to. so I'm playing each scale there, but as thirds, as arpeggios, extended arpeggio. So you should do that over the whole tune. Obviously, I'm just doing 4 chords here because the video is already going to be a long video. But I'll make a little PDF with all my suggestions for extended arpeggios over all the chords, and I'll put that on my Patreon page. So now we're not playing, we're not improvising, we're not doing anything creative, we're just figuring out where the notes are. So here's the thing, we need to get out of the idea of, oh, I'm playing G Dorian and then F Dorian, right? And start thinking that I have to play from G Dorian to F Dorian. It's the change that is important to focus on. Not this chord and that chord, but the transition. So we need to figure out how to practice playing over the bar line. Some people get confused when I say over the bar line, because when we talk about playing over the bar line in music, we're usually talking about rhythmic ideas. But here I just mean playing something that goes over the bar line. So different ways you could do that. You could just play the scale and then land on the closest note, like continue on the scale, but land on a note that works with the next scale. Maybe start on the third. I'm actually gonna boil it down to just the first 2 chords. It is a good idea to kind of work on smaller sections of the chord changes, especially focusing in on the chord changes that you find most difficult. You want to pay attention to the difference between when you're going like that. There, I'm landing on a note that was not part of the previous scale. So that sounds very different. It gives a different feeling than if I'm doing the F. There is the 5th of F minor, but that note is not as surprising because it belongs to the previous scale. Some of those notes belong to both scales. So it's very different when if I'm landing on that A flat. You might want to do that because, I mean, the melody, after all, does that. But you might also not want to do that. So, for example, the G minor pentatonic scale works over both those chords. So you might want to practice that for a while. Just try to play some G minor pentatonic. Another exercise that I strongly recommend is something that I think is called the continuous scale or something like that, where you just play half notes or whole notes even, going up on this one string and then changing according to the scale. So if I start on F, A flat, C, playing half notes, I guess. So I'm aware of what the function of the note is. Third, minor third, root, flat 7, flat 7. That's a really good exercise, and I've said this before, but every time or if you make a mistake, you want to make sure that you start over and don't make the mistake. So that's how you slowly program yourself to get better. That's how you learn. If you do only that for a day, like in one day's practice session, you make a mistake and you get lost. Like, oh wait, what's the next note and how does it relate to the chord? You figure it out, you go back and you do it the right way, then even if that's 5 minutes, that's a great practice session that day because you actually learned something. And if you think that, wait, this is way too easy, you can do it with chords. I suggest doing it with maybe fourths, but I'm already playing the chords in the backing track or the loop, so I'll make a loop with only fifths. And then I'll play fourths, so I can start with this shape. That's a really good exercise. You could do it with a lot of different kind of chord shapes. I just picked fourths, work really great for that kind of exercise. Just on a side note, like notice the difference. If I leave the chord open like that, notice how much space I'm giving myself. You might think that's a crazy thing to play power chords on a way shorter tune, but we shouldn't think like that. We shouldn't think just because power chords are often played in heavy metal, for example, we shouldn't think, oh, because of that I can't play power chords. That's a snobby attitude, and it's the wrong attitude, I think. I see modern jazz players, they play power chords all the time. Fifths, great sound. Gives you a whole different feel to the tune. I'm not saying you should play it like that, but it's just we sometimes make the mistake that we have to play the whole big chord every time. And we don't really have to. Sometimes it's a good idea to leave space. Okay, so there's a lot to be said about how to approach soloing of this tune. Now we are familiar with the scales and we know how to play over the bar line. We want to think about how we should play. But before we do that, there's one more thing you could do to kind of get used to this kind of progression. I'm going to go back to the first 4 chords here. There's a thing you could do, which I think is called finding the half steps or locating the half steps. So these are diatonic scales, except the symmetrical diminished scale, the half whole scale. The first 3 scales are diatonic, meaning that there are 2 places in those scales where there's a half step. If you can find that half step, that will help you kind of locate where you are in the harmony. So G minor, there's a half step between A and B flat. So you play that. Then you could go to G and A flat. Then you could go to maybe D. And here, the diminished, there are plenty of half steps. 4, I think. And then there's here. Or you can play like this. Inverted half step. I think that's a pretty good exercise. It makes you think differently, and it kind of helps you to navigate through the harmony, Because if you think about it, if you know where the half steps are, the rest is just whole steps. So now we talked about the scales. So in the beginning I said there are 3 things we need to consider. The fact that it's non-functional harmony. So we talked about that we're not really thinking about guide tones and bob scales. So I wouldn't play this tune like this kind of, you know. You know, running scales and stuff like that. So I wouldn't play like that. I wouldn't approach it like that. I mean, you could do that, but it's not how I think of it. And that brings me to the next point, which is that it's a Wayne Shorter tune. So it's not a fast bebop tune or anything like that. This conversation came up in the comment section there for my video where I play this tune. And we have so much respect for Wayne Shorter and some other, like John Coltrane and stuff like that, that we shy away from actually playing the tunes because it's a little bit scary. They're almost considered holy, these tunes. And I wouldn't presume to suggest that I know how to play over this tune. This is not a video on what goes on inside Wayne Shorter's head when he's playing this tune or when he wrote this tune. I have no idea. I'm just approaching it the way I would play this tune. And I also remember I had a teacher once who said, remember, it's only a tune. Because it can be damaging for our creativity if we have too much respect for these tunes, right? At the same time, we should have respect for these tunes. So it's a balance there. You have to figure it out. In my defense, though, my most influential teacher was Scott Henderson. And Scott Henderson has a pretty good understanding of this kind of music. And that might surprise some people. A lot of people think of Scott Henderson as this goofy fusion blues player, which he is. But when he started out, he played with Joe Zawinul for many years. And Chick Corea and Jean-Luc Ponty is pretty serious stuff. And obviously, Joe Zawinul played with Wayne Shorter. So he's kind of steeped in that style. So he had a lot of thoughts on how to play over a tune like this. He was very much focused on phrasing. So a couple of things we can do to kind of get into that kind of mindset of how to play in this style is to think about phrases rather than scales and stuff like that. So let's find a phrase. You could always take a phrase from the actual tune. We could find something like here, for example. You know. Or both those phrases are in the tune. Let's take that one. So what is it? Let's analyze it. So let's think of it like this. 1, 4, flat 7, 5. So 1, 4, flat 7, 5. Then I just play that phrase, that idea. You need to take a really simple idea when you do this. And you play that over the different chords. So you might want to do it as an ear training exercise first. So here it's a little bit problematic with the A13 flat 9 chord. I'll explain in a second. So what I did there is I'm treating now this chord. In order to do this exercise properly, you need to come up with a diatonic scale, a 7-note scale for every chord. So there is a way to figure out how to create a 7-note scale over that chord. I'm playing a I guess it's a G Lydian minor. Lydian scale with a minor third. This stuff is mentioned in that book, Lydian Chromatic Concept. So I guess that's a D harmonic major scale. Starting on G. Then you get kind of an A dominant scale with a flat 9. So here, imagine you can take that phrase and go anywhere with it. That's what intrigued me about jazz in the beginning. When I was in high school and the older students were playing jazz, I was playing classical music. And the fact that they could improvise, it wasn't the chops or the fast bop stuff that blew my mind. It was how they could take a melody and you hear the melody and they move it, but you can still follow along with the improvisation. And still to this day, that's the thing about jazz improvisation that I find most fascinating and enjoyable when I listen to really good jazz players. I don't hear that in other genres of music that much. Blues, I guess, but it's very related to jazz. So imagine you could take that phrase and just go in the other direction, for example. That's really hard to do, but really fun to practice. Another thing you could do is, instead of 1, 4, flat 7, 5 of the actual chord, I could go 1, 4, flat 7, or 1, 4, 7, 5 of the home scale. So G minor, G Dorian is actually F major. F Dorian is E flat major. So if I do that, it sounds like this. 1, 4, 7, 5 of F. And then B flat, right? And D. So. Now I'm mixing them up. I have talked about this before, and it's something I got from that book, The Advancing Guitarist by Mikko. I can't remember what page, I don't have the book in front of me, but one of the chapters in that book deals with this idea, and he takes it further. There are 2 more ways you could take the same idea even further, if you're interested in that stuff. Notice now, though, we're back to playing chord by chord, so a more sophisticated way to do this would be play over the bar lines here too, right? Then you have to think a little bit differently. So the idea here, this is what Scott Henderson always talked about, that the phrase, the shape of the phrase is what is important. That's what the audience is hearing. So it's 2 notes going up, bo, da, dee, and then down. So up, down. So you don't have to be this strict and dogmatic about it, you could just do it way more freely and just try to play something up, down. People will still hear that as the same idea, musical idea. Let's try to do this. You know. That's the kind of headspace you want to be in when you're doing this stuff. Try to paint something and play motifs and, you know, rather than playing, it's almost easier to say how not to play. Like, you don't want to be playing your flashy, super fast arpeggios. And I mean, you can do that too every now and then, sure, but you shouldn't base your improvisation on a tune like this on that. It should be more based on the kind of motifs. Another aspect of that is that if you establish a motif in the listener's ear, then you can take that motif and kind of go outside, because the motif in and of itself trumps the chord scale. It's more important to continue with the musical idea than to always play the exact same scale. This is a little bit harder to demonstrate, but I'll try my best. So I'll play inside. Now you hear this, right? Then I'm inside again. So maybe not the best demonstration there, but I think you get the idea that even though the notes are totally outside, the phrase is, you can still follow the phrase. So it's a little bit harder to demonstrate just like that, but it's fun to practice that way too. And you should record yourself and listen back to it when you practice that stuff. Now this brings me to the next point, which is timing. When somebody asked me, could you make a video on how to play over ballads? The third thing we need to consider, the fact that it's a ballad. My thought was like, well, it's playing over ballads is a huge thing. So it's very different if you're playing like a slow swing tune, right? That's a ballad. Or if you're playing like a rubato ballad, or maybe like a kind of an even eight ballad, could be more or less broken. You could play in the style kind of the ECM where it's very loose, but they still have some kind of form that they're playing over, but there's no subdivision really. So there are many different ways you could play a ballad. But the thing is, you don't want to be locked into a subdivision that much when you're playing. If you play just eighth note, that gets kind of boring. So you want to try to play out of time sometimes. So I'm not really thinking about a subdivision there. That's actually really hard for some students to do that because they're so used to playing in a certain subdivision that it's hard to let go of that. So that's also something we need to practice. And so you can approach that differently. One way to get into that is to pick a really tricky subdivision, maybe quintuplets or something. Play quintuplets. So I don't care now if I'm actually keeping the quintuplets or if I'm kind of all over the place. It doesn't matter because that's the point. I want to play out of time. There's another thing you can do, it's called pointillistic playing. I think it's called pointillistic. It's mentioned in one of Jerry Bergonzi's volumes. I think it's the volume 7. The idea of just, imagine you're a painter or an artist. You're just kind of drawing sporadically without any kind of coherent idea. You're just kind of painting. So I'll try to demonstrate. This stuff is hard to demonstrate. But so it's not in time. but that's also kind of too much when you do that. So, but if you're only playing in time over a ballad, it sounds painful after a while. But what I just did there would also be kind of weird. You want to balance things, and you can play in time. You could play swing. If you want, you can exaggerate the swing. Or exaggerate not playing swing. Go in and out of that and stretch the time and go into different subdivisions. There's much more you could do in that kind of with that than if you're playing on a medium up tune where you have to kind of be locked into the timing, and it sounds vague if you're not playing in time. This is not swinging. It's a ballad. It's loose. It's more about painting, you know. Not sure if I do the best job here explaining that, but those are some things that I think about when I try to play over a tune like Improvise. And yeah, as always, I have some PDFs on this stuff, and the arrangement that I made is gonna be on my Patreon page. And I'll also make a bonus video where I go over that arrangement. And if you want the PDF but you don't want to be a Patreon, you can always contact me on here. Anyway, so that's all I had for this week's lesson, and thank you for your time and attention, and I shall see you next